Well, guys, we have reached the penultimate episode of the book Ithaca. Supposedly, this is Joyce's favorite episode, and it is in the form, a very pronounced form of question and answers. And I wasn't aware until this reading, actually, that that is based on, in the church, the catechism, which I wasn't really raised in a very churchy way, so I was not familiar with this at all. But catechisms, I guess, are books, and there's different ones for different churches, different organizations that often, but not always, are in the form of this question and answer. The word catechism comes from the Greek. It means to teach orally. So basically to explain ideas relating to religion, and there are many. You can read a lot more than you probably want to read about it on the Wikipedia page for catechism, and it will provide links to different versions and so on and so on. But Joyce is going to use that format, and it's going to be a very unusual format for fiction. This episode broadly consists of three main sections: the walk from the cabman's shelter to Bloom's house, the chat between Stephen and Bloom in Bloom's kitchen, and then finally Bloom going to bed and talking with Molly in their bed for a while and then going to sleep. Those are the three main points of this episode. If Joyce is teaching us something, as catechisms do, what is he teaching us? I mean, we're going to be getting a lot of data or information about our three main characters. There's definitely a lot of that provided, a lot of dates and figures and information, probably too much information about some things that you are not interested in at all. And it can seem kind of dry and sterile, but sterile. But I think that is one of the episode's tricks, because underneath these facts and figures, there are going to be some very poetic moments, some very subtle emotions that just suddenly sneak in. And I think that is part of Joyce's ability to do that in such a mechanical, seemingly mechanical episode. Not really any spoken dialogue, just maybe a few minor quotes. It can be very subtle because you're not expecting emotions and feelings amidst all this dry information. So when it does happen, it can be quite surprising, and that can make it quite a bit stronger. One great example of this is the suicide note of Bloom's father. We're not going to get the entire note, but we're going to get pieces of it, and just those pieces will be enough to show quite a bit. I'll quote it in full later. But aside from our characters, we also have these shifts in scale that I had talked about a long time ago. I have no idea where, but I was talking about how we can look at the city in terms of individuals, the microscopic world. We're going to see something similar to that here, because we're going to be expanding our gaze of the story to include the entire cosmos, from the vastest distances all the way to the microscopic. And not just the scale, but also the fields of intelligence, the way that we're looking at this information. It can be looked at, we'll look at it mathematically, historically, many different ways. So I think we've seen things like that throughout the book, but as always, it's a little different with each new technique. And like some of the other tangents that we've seen in the book, these can go on for pages, and you may not be clear, why is Joyce doing this? I think, especially with this episode, he's showing that, like with Wandering Rocks, that we could branch off into all these other stories, that our story that we've been following of Bloom and Stephen and Molly is just a drop in the bucket of the vast, infinite stories that are constantly branching off in all directions all around us, and that this could be all we've seen, as Joyce points out at one point, is the parenthesis of one brief moment in their lives, but also in each life is just one parenthesis in the life of the universe. Endless networks of organizing principles and systems within systems within systems that just seem infinitely deep. Let's do our obligatory look at the Odyssey and how it corresponds to this episode. So Odysseus, he has arrived back at Ithaca, and he returns to his home, his house, and he's disguised though as a beggar, and he finds in the house, as he has been warned by Eumaeus and Telemachus, that there are all these suitors in the house. and he just keeps his cool. He stays as a beggar, and they kind of abuse him and throw a chair at him at one point, and they do a few things, but he just kind of hangs around, and then they decide to do this contest to see who can string this huge bow that's really strong. So they do this contest, and none of them could do it. It's kind of like the sword and the stone. It's only one person is capable of doing it, and it ain't any of these guys. But then, on a whim, they decide to let the beggar try, and lo and behold, he is able to, and it's clear that there's going to be trouble. So Telemachus, he and Odysseus, they seal up the house, and then they just slaughter the suitors. Long story short, Odysseus reclaims his home. And then I guess during all this time, Penelope has been sleeping, and she comes to find this beggar who has slaughtered all these men. And she kind of thinks maybe this is Odysseus, but she's not sure. She does a little test. She explains about their bed, and only Odysseus knows about it. So it proves it is Odysseus, and they greet each other as knowing who they are. So I've decided to walk you through this episode in two different ways. First, we'll look at those three actions, the three kind of major actions that happen among the characters in this episode, and then I'll point out a bunch of things that I think you should notice that were revealed by this questioner who's asking all these questions. Sometimes the voice of the narrative voice who is asking these questions is referred to as the catechist because it is in the form of a catechism, but you can call them a questioner or the catechist. It is now the wee hours of the morn. I think we're meant to believe that they leave the cabman's shelter, the location of Eumaeus last episode. I think we're meant to believe that they leave there around 2 a.m., 2 o'clock in the morning, and their path, you can see along here, it's the red path that goes from about number 11 to number 1. If you want to look at this image in more detail, you can find it on the Wikipedia page for Ulysses. And Stephen and Bloom are going to be talking about a lot of different things along the way. We just get a brief synopsis of what they talked about. We don't get any of the actual conversation, though, similar to, we got more conversation in Eumaeus, but now we're getting virtually no conversation, just summary. And for all the detail, the excessive detail that we get in this episode, it's a little frustrating because what we want is, to hear the actual conversation between Bloom and Stephen, between Bloom and Molly later on. But that is not what we get. Joyce, he knows he's frustrating us, and what we are going to get instead is all these tangents. They eventually arrive at the Bloom house at 7 Eccles Street, and when they get there, Bloom realizes he has forgotten his key. He tried to remind himself, I think in Calypso, to get the key out of his trousers. He'd left them in the pants that he wore the day before or something, but he did not remember. Like the returning to the Sweeney's to pay for that soap, he never did it. He's just a bit absent-minded. He loses his focus on other things. So instead of opening the front door with a key, he uses a trick. He lowers himself. So I guess the first floor is kind of like the entryway with a hall, and then the kitchen is downstairs, and there's like a sunken kind of outdoor patio that he can get down to. So what he's going to do is kind of climb over the railings and hang himself down and drop down, and then he'll go in through the kitchen door, which I guess is unlocked, and he'll let Stephen in through the upstairs front door. And that is what he does. He does it more or less successfully, and then they head inside to the kitchen where they're going to sit down, and Stephen and Bloom are going to have some cocoa, maybe a bite to eat too, I can't remember that, but they do definitely drink cocoa at least to help Stephen regain his bearings. As they drink their cocoa and talk a bit more, we again just have the summary, so it's hard to say how they actually relate to each other, and I'm guessing from what they talk about that by this point Stephen may not be quite as cranky, and as he's sobering up, he may not be quite as irritable, but Bloom actually gets him to kind of chant a little song that he knows. But the song is, you can read the entire lyrics, and Joyce actually prints the music, but it's about a boy who hits a ball and it breaks this Jew's window, and he's like invited into the house by the daughter, and the daughter cuts off his head. So it's for Stephen, somebody who we've seen his parable earlier in the book, the parable of the plums. I'm sure Stephen he doesn't say it outright, but I'm sure by this point he knows that Bloom has a daughter, and Bloom seems to be kind of insinuating that, hey, you should kind of enter into our household, either teaching Molly Italian or somehow maybe marrying Millie is kind of being implied. But I think Stephen is suggesting to Bloom that that's not going to happen, that he's not going to say that outright, but by this message he's saying that, like, that's not the story that I'm going to follow. But also with this story, with most of Stephen's references, there's this Christ-like suggestion of being sacrificed, a sacrificial lamb. As Bloom thinks about his daughter Millie, there's definitely an awareness of sadness about this transition taking place in her life, and he's trying to kind of take control of it by maybe introducing Stephen into the equation, but that is not going to happen. We learn that Stephen won't even, in fact, be spending the night like on their couch or something. He's going to be leaving soon. Was the proposal of asylum accepted? Promptly, inexplicably, with amicability, gratefully, it was declined. Joyce is very good at putting his sentences together so that until the very last word you don't know what the sentence, actually the direction of the sentence. But for all this, Stephen is going to have his money returned to him by Bloom. Remember, in the brothel, Bloom agreed to hang on to it just so Stephen wouldn't lose it while he was drunk. So he gets his money back. It's a good amount of money, so maybe Stephen can find a cheap hotel or boarding house or something to spend the night, at least get a good night's sleep. And there's this implication that perhaps Stephen might at least be willing to teach Molly some Italian, give her some Italian lessons in the future. But I'm kind of guessing that maybe he's just kind of saying this so that Bloom won't think he's abandoning him completely. Like so much about what happens after the episodes in this book, we don't really know. We will have hints throughout this episode that Boylan was there. We find his betting tickets from the Ascot Gold Cup race, which he bet on and lost. We'll find that the furniture in their parlor or living room has been rearranged so that I guess they can play piano more easily. And perhaps most rubbed in his face, when he gets up to his bedroom, he's going to find his bed. Somehow the impression of Boylan is noticed there. That seems, I don't know, can you really notice the impression of one person? Perhaps the bed is that malleable, but I'm guessing that's just Joyce kind of rubbing the fact in his face. Or maybe Bloom's imagining that he can feel the impression in the bed. As Stephen is getting ready to leave, they step outside, and we have this beautiful line. They step outside under the heaven tree of stars, hung with humid blue night fruit. This is a great example of what I was talking about, of Joyce slipping in poetry in the midst of these sterile facts. And when they're outside, they decide to have a pissing contest to see who can piss farther or higher. I guess Bloom can pee farther, but Stephen can pee higher. And to me, I mean, it kind of reminds me of the arc of like a bow being bent, maybe from the Odyssey, but also Daedalus and Icarus, when they flew, Icarus, the sun, flew higher towards the sun, and his wings melted, and I guess he died. That's how he met his death. Although really, if you go higher, it's actually cooler, but they didn't really know that. Anyways, that's what that reminds me of. They hear a bell chime 4 o'clock, so the passage of time, the walk from the cabman's shelter, that was a pretty good distance, and then hanging around in their kitchen as he made the cocoa, and then they talked for a while. So about 2 hours have passed, and we may not realize that in the midst of so little dialogue, so little actually happening that we see. They shake hands as Stephen is leaving, and he's going to God knows where, but then after he's gone, Bloom just kind of hangs outside a moment in the emptiness of the night. And it just feels so, after such a day packed with activity and interactions and thoughts and memories, it just feels like such a moment of pristine silence and emptiness. Alone, what did Bloom feel? The cold of interstellar space, thousands of degrees below freezing point or the absolute zero of Fahrenheit, centigrade, or Réaumur. The incipient intimations of proximate dawn. He goes back inside and he bumps his head on the furniture because it's been rearranged. And also, though, remember Odysseus getting hit with a chair, so there's another correspondence. Information about Bloom is presented in some unique ways. We get a collection of his books, the titles at least, and we get the contents of one of his drawers. We get a list of how he spent money that day and how he received money. And in these lists, for example, the tab that he kept, or that he didn't keep, actually, the narrator keeps. It's we learn some things, for example, like how he got from Sandymount Strand and back to the city so quickly. So there's these tram rides, that little information like that is provided. All this, though, is adding up to our image and our portrait of Bloom, and just little brush strokes of information. And some elements of naturalism. Bloom is picking at his toenail and picks off a fragment and then he sniffs it. Little details like this that have absolutely nothing to, as part of the narrative, what do? But they do paint a picture of this person.